What if everything you've heard about avoidant people is only half the story? Most people assume that when someone pulls away, becomes quiet, or seems emotionally distant, it means they're losing interest. But that's not always true. In fact, some of the strongest feelings can create the most confusing behavior. Avoidant individuals often experience love differently. Instead of rushing closer, deep emotions can trigger fear, vulnerability, and an internal struggle that makes them appear distant when they're actually feeling more connected than ever. So, if you've been wondering whether the distance means rejection or if there's something deeper happening beneath the surface, this video is for you. Today, we're revealing 6 surprising signs that an avoidant isn't avoiding because of a lack of feelings, they're avoiding because they're falling in love. One of the most confusing experiences is watching someone become emotionally close, only to suddenly create distance right afterward. At first, everything seems to be moving in a positive direction. Conversations become more meaningful, personal stories are shared, and a sense of trust begins to develop naturally. There's laughter, comfort, and a growing feeling that the connection is becoming something special. Then, without warning, communication slows down. Responses become shorter. The energy changes. The warmth that was present only days before seems to disappear, leaving the other person wondering what went wrong. Most people immediately assume this shift means a loss of interest. After all, in many situations, distance can signal emotional withdrawal. But when it comes to avoidant attachment patterns, the situation is often much more complicated than it appears on the surface. The very moment that feels exciting and comforting to one person can feel emotionally overwhelming to someone who struggles with vulnerability. As emotional intimacy increases, so does the sense of exposure. Suddenly, the connection becomes real. The possibility of being hurt becomes real. The fear of losing control over emotions becomes real. Instead of feeling safe in that closeness, an avoidant person may start experiencing internal anxiety. Thoughts begin to race. Questions appear that weren't there before. What if this relationship becomes too important? What if expectations increase? What if emotional dependence develops? What if things eventually fall apart? These fears are rarely discussed openly. In fact, many avoidant individuals may not even fully understand what is happening inside themselves. They simply feel an intense urge to pull back. The distance becomes a way of creating emotional breathing room. It's an attempt to regain a sense of balance after feelings have become stronger than expected. What makes this behavior so confusing is that the withdrawal often happens right after a meaningful moment. A deep conversation, a vulnerable confession, an emotional connection, or a particularly happy experience together can unintentionally trigger the need for space. To the other person, it feels backwards. If the connection was so positive, why retreat? But for someone uncomfortable with emotional vulnerability, closeness can activate fears just as powerfully as it activates affection. This doesn't mean every disappearing act is a sign of love. Sometimes people genuinely lose interest. However, when distance consistently follows moments of emotional closeness, it may reveal an internal struggle rather than emotional detachment. The connection has become significant enough to create vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel intimidating. Ironically, the very behavior that appears to say, "I don't care," can sometimes be driven by emotions that are becoming impossible to ignore. The stronger the feelings grow, the harder they become to manage, and that inner conflict often creates the distance that leaves everyone confused. Not everyone expresses affection through grand gestures, constant compliments, or dramatic declarations of love. Some people reveal their feelings in much quieter ways that can easily go unnoticed unless you know what to look for. One of the most telling signs is an unusual ability to remember small details that most people would forget. Imagine mentioning your favorite snack during a casual conversation weeks ago, only to have someone bring it up unexpectedly much later. Maybe you once shared a story about a childhood memory, talked about an important meeting you were nervous about, or mentioned a goal you hoped to achieve someday. While others might hear these things and move on, Someone who is emotionally invested often stores these details away without even realizing it. This behavior is especially meaningful when it comes to avoidant individuals. While they may struggle to openly communicate their emotions, they often observe far more than they reveal. They may not always express affection verbally, but they pay attention. They notice patterns, preferences, worries, and the little pieces of information that make someone unique. The reason this matters is simple. People naturally dedicate mental energy to things that are important to them. In a world full of distractions, remembering specific details requires attention. It means someone was truly listening rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. It shows that what was said carried enough value to stay in their mind long after the conversation ended. Sometimes these memories appear in subtle ways. They might ask about an event that was mentioned weeks earlier. They may remember the name of a family member, recall a challenge that was discussed months ago, or check in about something that seemed minor at the time. These moments often feel surprisingly personal because they reveal a level of attention that goes beyond ordinary conversation. For avoidant individuals, this can become one of the safest ways to show care. Direct emotional expression may feel uncomfortable or vulnerable, but remembering details allows them to demonstrate affection without openly discussing their feelings. Instead of saying, "You matter to me," they show it through attentiveness. Instead of making emotional speeches, they remember the things that are important to the people they care about. What's particularly revealing is that these details are often not connected to practical needs. They are small, personal, and seemingly insignificant facts that have no reason to remain in memory unless genuine interest exists. Yet somehow, they do. They stay because the person connected to those details occupies a meaningful place in their thoughts. While words can sometimes be spoken out of habit, attention is much harder to fake. Consistently remembering the little things reflects emotional investment, curiosity, and care. And when someone who rarely reveals their feelings continues to remember the smallest pieces of your life, it may be saying far more than words ever could. One of the clearest signs that deeper feelings may be developing is when someone continues finding ways to stay connected, even while appearing distant. At first glance, the behavior can seem contradictory. There may be periods of silence, moments when communication slows down, or times when emotional closeness seems to fade. Yet somehow, the connection never completely disappears. A message arrives unexpectedly, a funny video gets shared, a question is asked that doesn't really require an answer. Small interactions continue to appear, creating a thread of connection that remains intact despite the distance. For many people, this behavior can be confusing. If someone truly wants space, why keep reaching out? Why continue creating moments of contact instead of simply moving on? The answer often lies beneath the surface. Emotional attachment does not always disappear just because someone struggles with intimacy. In fact, the stronger the feelings become, the more complex the behavior can look from the outside. Avoidant individuals often experience a tension between wanting connection and wanting emotional safety. On one side is the desire to be close to someone who matters. On the other side is the fear of becoming too vulnerable, too dependent, or too emotionally exposed. This internal conflict can make direct expressions of affection feel overwhelming. As a result, maintaining contact through smaller, safer interactions becomes a way of staying connected without fully confronting those deeper emotions. This is why seemingly insignificant messages can carry more meaning than they appear to. A random meme, a casual question, or a brief check-in may not seem romantic on the surface. Yet these actions often serve a purpose. They keep the connection alive. They create opportunities for interaction without requiring intense emotional conversations. They allow someone to remain present in another person's life while avoiding the vulnerability that deeper discussions might bring. Another important detail is consistency. Anyone can send a random message once. What stands out is when these small attempts at connection happen repeatedly over time. Even after periods of withdrawal, the contact returns. Even after creating distance, there is another reason to reach out. The pattern continues because the emotional bond continues. In many cases, these moments are not carefully planned. They happen naturally because someone remains on their mind. A funny video sparks a thought. A song reminds them of a conversation. An event triggers a memory. The instinct to share those moments reveals that the connection still occupies space in their thoughts, even during periods when emotions are not being openly discussed. Actions often reveal what words cannot. While some people express love through direct communication, others show it through presence. They find small reasons to stay involved, small reasons to reconnect, and small reasons to remind someone that they have not been forgotten. When the connection continues to survive periods of distance and silence, those seemingly ordinary interactions may actually be revealing something much deeper. A desire to remain emotionally connected, even when expressing those feelings directly, feels difficult. Trust is not something that develops overnight, especially for people who naturally protect their emotions. Some individuals move through life with carefully constructed walls around their inner world. They may appear confident, independent, and unaffected on the outside, but beneath that surface exists a private side that very few people ever get to see. This is why one of the strongest signs of deep emotional attachment is when someone begins revealing parts of themselves that are normally hidden from everyone else. For avoidant individuals, emotional self-protection often becomes a way of life. Over time, they learn to keep certain thoughts, fears, insecurities, and vulnerabilities locked away. It feels safer that way. When people cannot see those sensitive parts, there is less risk of judgment, disappointment, rejection, or emotional pain. Maintaining control over what others know becomes a form of protection. Because of this, emotional openness carries a different level of significance. When someone who is usually guarded starts sharing personal experiences, it often means a great deal of trust has developed. The information being shared may not seem dramatic at first. It could be a story about a difficult childhood experience, a past relationship that left emotional scars, a fear that rarely gets discussed, or an insecurity that has been hidden for years. What matters is not necessarily the topic itself, but the willingness to reveal it. These moments often happen gradually rather than all at once. The walls do not come down in a single conversation. Instead, small pieces of the inner world begin to emerge over time. A personal memory is shared, a private concern is mentioned, an honest emotion is expressed. Each revelation represents a choice to allow someone closer than most people are ever allowed to be. What makes this especially meaningful is the level of risk involved. Vulnerability requires trust because it creates uncertainty. Once personal feelings are revealed, they can be misunderstood, dismissed, or used against someone. For a person who values emotional safety, that possibility can feel intimidating. Choosing to open up despite those fears demonstrates that the connection has become important enough to outweigh the desire for complete self-protection. Another sign of growing trust is authenticity. Instead of always presenting a strong or composed version of themselves, they begin showing imperfections. They admit mistakes. They acknowledge doubts. They reveal emotions that they normally keep hidden. In those moments, they are no longer trying to maintain a carefully controlled image. They are allowing someone to see who they really are beneath the surface. This kind of openness cannot usually be forced. It develops when someone feels emotionally safe and genuinely valued. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the more willing they may be to share parts of themselves that have remained hidden for a very long time. While words of affection can sometimes be difficult for avoidant individuals to express, vulnerability often speaks louder than any declaration. When someone begins opening doors that are usually locked, revealing thoughts and feelings that few others have access to, it often signals something powerful. The connection has become important enough to trust with the most protected parts of their heart. One of the most confusing aspects of dealing with an avoidant person is the mixed signals. One moment there is warmth, attention, and genuine emotional connection. Conversations flow naturally, interest feels obvious, and everything seems to be moving in a positive direction. Then, suddenly, without any clear explanation, the energy changes. Communication becomes less frequent. Responses feel distant. The same person who seemed emotionally available yesterday now appears detached or hard to reach. For many people, this inconsistency feels like a warning sign. It creates uncertainty and raises questions about where they stand. Was the connection real? Did something go wrong? Has interest faded? These are natural conclusions because consistency is often associated with genuine feelings. However, when avoidant attachment patterns are involved, mixed signals can sometimes reflect an internal struggle rather than a lack of emotional investment. The reality is that strong feelings can create a conflict between two powerful desires. On one side is the desire for closeness, companionship, and emotional connection. On the other side is the desire to protect independence, maintain control, and avoid vulnerability. Both needs exist at the same time, and they often compete with each other. When the desire for connection becomes stronger, an avoidant person may move closer emotionally. They become more engaged in conversations, share more of themselves, and seek greater interaction. During these moments, their feelings are often genuine and sincere. They enjoy the connection and appreciate the growing bond. Yet, as intimacy increases, so does the awareness of emotional risk. This is where the internal conflict begins. The closer someone becomes, the more important they become. The more important they become, the greater the possibility of emotional pain if something goes wrong. Suddenly, fears that were once distant begin to feel very real. Concerns about dependency, rejection, disappointment, or loss can surface even when the relationship itself is healthy. As a result, a need for distance may emerge. Not necessarily because the feelings have disappeared, but because those feelings have become intense enough to trigger discomfort. Pulling back temporarily can feel like a way to regain emotional balance and reduce the anxiety created by vulnerability. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to understand is that it often confuses the avoidant person as well. They may genuinely want closeness while simultaneously feeling uncomfortable with it. They may miss someone while also needing space. They may care deeply while struggling to express that care consistently. These seemingly contradictory emotions can create behaviors that appear unpredictable from the outside. The push and pull dynamic that follows is rarely enjoyable for anyone involved. Yet it often reveals an ongoing battle between emotional attachment and emotional self-protection. While mixed signals should never be used as the only measure of someone's feelings, they can sometimes indicate that a deeper emotional process is taking place beneath the surface. When someone repeatedly moves closer, then retreats, then returns again, it may not be a sign that they don't care. In some cases, it is evidence of someone trying to navigate feelings that are far stronger than they know how to comfortably handle. Perhaps the most powerful sign of deep emotional attachment is not what happens during moments of closeness, but what happens after periods of distance. Many people can show interest when everything feels easy, exciting, and emotionally comfortable. The real test often comes when challenges arise, misunderstandings occur, or someone feels overwhelmed enough to pull away. What happens next can reveal far more about the true depth of a connection. One of the most noticeable patterns is that despite creating distance, the connection never completely ends. Time passes, communication slows, and it may seem like the relationship is fading away. Yet somehow, contact eventually returns. A conversation starts again, a message appears unexpectedly, an attempt is made to reconnect. The cycle repeats itself, not because of obligation, but because the emotional bond remains present beneath the surface. For avoidant individuals, creating distance is often a coping mechanism rather than a final decision. When emotions become intense, stepping back can feel safer than staying fully engaged. It provides time to process feelings, regain a sense of control, and reduce the discomfort that vulnerability sometimes creates. However, if genuine feelings are involved, distance rarely erases them completely. This is why returning matters. Walking away permanently requires emotional detachment. Returning requires emotional attachment. It suggests that despite the desire for space, the connection continues to occupy an important place in their thoughts. The relationship remains meaningful enough to draw them back, even after periods of withdrawal. What's particularly significant is that these returns often happen without obvious external pressure. Nobody forces the reconnection. Nobody demands it. Instead, the desire to reestablish contact emerges naturally. A memory surfaces, curiosity returns, the absence becomes noticeable. Thoughts drift back to the person who still holds emotional significance. In many cases, the return is not dramatic. There may be no grand declaration of feelings or emotional speech. Instead, it often begins with something simple: a casual message, a reaction to a story, a small conversation starter. While these gestures may appear ordinary, they frequently represent a much larger emotional reality. Reaching out is often easier than openly discussing why the connection still matters. Another important detail is persistence over time. Anyone can reconnect once out of boredom, loneliness, or temporary curiosity. What stands out is a consistent pattern of returning. Even after creating space, the connection remains difficult to let go of. The person continues finding reasons to come back because the emotional bond continues to exist. Of course, returning alone does not automatically mean love. Context always matters, and healthy relationships require more than repeated reconnections. However, when someone consistently circles back despite fears, hesitation, and periods of emotional distance, it often reveals something important. The connection has become too meaningful to simply disappear. Sometimes love does not look like constant closeness or perfect communication. Sometimes it looks like someone wrestling with their own fears, needing space to process emotions, yet still finding their way back again and again. When a person repeatedly returns despite every instinct telling them to stay distant, that persistence can be one of the strongest indicators that the feelings run far deeper than they are able to express openly.